The House of Mystery presents Inside Writing, the radio show where authors discuss their writing process in all genres.
Tonight we have Jay Margolis and Richard Buskin. How are you guys doing today?
We're doing great, thanks.
Now, let's start out by telling the listeners a little bit about yourselves.
An author and freelance journalist now for over 30 years. I've written over 30 books. I had a New York Times bestseller with a biography of Princess Diana. My main focus on books has been film, music, popular culture. But I have branched out in various ways. I've written for magazines around the world. And I basically was born in London, England, and I moved to Los Angeles in 1995 and then relocated to Chicago in 1999, and that's where I've been ever since.
And Jay?
Yes, I'm an investigative reporter, and I like to deal with, deaths that seem unresolved, Marilyn Monroe being one of them. Another one that I am working on is Robert Kennedy. In fact, for my second book, The Murder of Marilyn Monroe, Case Closed, there's a postscript, 19-page postscript in which, we reveal for the first time who murdered Robert Kennedy. We reveal the identity of the third shooter. So I have a background. I'm a Jeff Dunlap research scholar for writing a paper on African-American reparations. I went to the University of Southern California. I graduated a year early. And I'm just very interested in resolving things that seem unresolved as far as famous, unsolved deaths.
Well, thank you for taking the time and coming on the show. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Now, first of all, let's talk about how you guys got onto the Marilyn Monroe and the Case Closed book. What led you to write about this?
Well, back in the sort of early to mid-90s, around 1993, actually, I started a book about the films of Marilyn. And the whole idea there was, there had been so many books about her life, her affairs, her death. How about doing a book about, her career? No one had really done one that was in depth. So I did that book. It took me a few years to write and research. It actually ended up coming out in 2001. It was called Blonde Heat: The Sizzling Screen Career of Marilyn Monroe. However, during the course of doing that book, people would constantly be asking me what my theory was about her death. And, it was amazing. However much I was focusing on the film career, the way that Marilyn died, the circumstances, the mystery surrounding it, that was clearly what's still fascinating people. And so when, I basically hooked up with Jay and he was, focusing on that aspect of her life, it was like, okay, let's go for it. He'd already done so much research and it was so stunning, actually, what he was coming up with. For me, it was really a compelling subject to write a book about.
Right. And Jay, what brought you to Marilyn Monroe?
Well, the first book I ever picked up on Marilyn Monroe was by George Barris, and, I was always fascinated because every book that I picked up, whether it be, George Barris's book, because he personally believed that she was murdered, and so he wrote that in his own 1995 book, and so everybody had these three different camps. There was the murder, suicide, or accident. These were the three main arguments that people kept, believing in. And so I said, well, that seems pretty unresolved. And so I said, well, I'd like to investigate that. And it just, led me to believe that she was murdered with an empty stomach. I mean, that there is a big red flag.
Right. And so when you took this up, did you sort of have a fascination with Marilyn, or were you a fan or not?
I was definitely a fan. I thought that she was a beautiful woman, and I said, wow, this is pretty unique that she, at the time of her death, was the most famous woman in the world. I mean, nobody else had ever done that at that time, and now we have something different. In today's age, you have Instagram where anybody can, get 1 million followers, if they really know what they're doing. So it's not like the same. It's just a different time period, and things have changed. but during her time period, there was no internet. And so for her to be able to do that was nothing short of remarkable, to become the most famous woman in the world. That was definitely fascinating. It was a big, thing that drew me to her.
Right.
Yeah, and in my case, it was that she was really a self-made woman, swimming against the tide of the Hollywood studio system, which was run by guys. And, over the course of her career, she not only really came up with that whole breathy, dumb blonde Marilyn Monroe persona that everyone knows and loves, but she then, also went on to become a serious actress. She had intense coaching under several top drama coaches, and ended up forming her own production company, having choice of director and script and co-stars. And, this is someone who really came from nothing and made herself the icon that she became.
Right. And so she was probably the biggest star at the time of her death, I would imagine. I think Liz Taylor was doing quite well too, but I would say she was probably the big box office at the time.
Yeah, she was. Liz Taylor, as you said, was commanding actually $1 million for being in Cleopatra, which was more than Marilyn was getting. But one of the, things that have been incorrectly reported down the years is that Marilyn was, died kind of in disgrace, that her career was in the doldrums. She was fired from her last film. What wasn't known at the time, has only come out over the years, is that in fact, when her last film, when she was fired from it, they tried to replace Marilyn in that film, Something's Got to Give. Her co-star, Dean Martin, refused to work with anyone other than Marilyn. And so they ended up having to go back to her and upping her salary from $100,000 to $500,000, and with a contract for a second film at the same fee. So actually her career was on the rise, not on the downward spiral when she died.
Where do you think she was going at the time? So she was, because like you said, a lot's reported about her, being fired and not doing well in the movie, and she wasn't getting along with her husband at the time either.
At the time that Something's Got to Give, she was not married.
Oh, she wasn't still with that producer?
Arthur Miller? No, she had already divorced him.
She had already divorced him. So that's kind of why I think people were sort of leaning towards suicide. Now, why did the studio keep that quiet, that they had rehired her?
It was very convenient for the studio. Basically, they rehired her just before her death. They hadn't announced that yet, because really that would put egg on their face, but they would have to announce it, of course. She died in the meantime, so they didn't have to. So they just left it like that, and the general public never knew what the backstory was.
So do you think the studio had anything to do with her death?
No, not directly. They had a lot to do with the cover-up after her death. Once they were notified, they took the documents that promised to, rehire her. I mean, they did a whole cleanup job of where anything that was in their benefit, they were cleaning up.
Well, why do you think that is? Like, if they did,
because otherwise they would have to, show how, they'd given her a new contract, and that doesn't make them look too good. They had the motive, means, and opportunity to do what they did, and they took advantage of that.
So now you were mentioning earlier, Richard, that she sort of put on that persona. So
yeah.
She was quite different than what people perceived her.
Yes, she was. She was way more intelligent than not only how the general public may have perceived her, but certainly how the studio bosses did, because, as I said, she rose through the ranks from a starlet to a superstar based on that breathy, dumb blonde persona. And that was, cash at the box office for 20th Century Fox. They didn't want to meddle with that formula. So when she then basically had established herself and said, now I want to be taken seriously, I want to be in maybe a casting of the film The Brothers Karamazov, they virtually laughed at her. It was like, you kidding? A, you're most likely not capable of that, and B, we're not interested. And so that's the point at which she actually walked out on her contract. It was after she'd completed the 7-year itch. And she walked out and went to New York for a year, studied at the Actors Studio in New York under Lee Strasberg, and refused to return until it was on her terms. And that's exactly what happened. That persona, I remember actually the daughter of, it was the daughter of Lee Strasberg, Susan Strasberg, the actress. She was walking with Marilyn in New York one day, down a New York street, and said, Marilyn was just in a headscarf and dark glasses. No one knew it was Marilyn Monroe. She was incognito. And she turned to Susan and said, "Do you want to see Marilyn?" I was like, "Yeah." And she basically just changed the way she walked, moved the hips a bit, and suddenly everyone was, the heads were turning. It was Marilyn Monroe. She could turn and turn off that, turn on and turn off that persona at will.
Yeah, I didn't realize that. And and now, Jay, you were talking about, so she divorced Arthur Miller. Now, the story is she was going to remarry DiMaggio?
That is correct. She was into statements that were made by her half-sister, Bernice Miracle, and her niece, Mona Ray Miracle. They both made statements that are very affirmative that she was going to remarry Joe DiMaggio. In fact, Mona Ray says that, according to Bernice, that Marilyn was looking forward to that she was looking forward to remarrying him, that it was definitely going to happen. In fact, the executor of Joe DiMaggio's estate, Morris Engelberg, who was in no relation to Marilyn's physician, Dr. Engelberg, Morris said that the date was set for August 8th, 1962, which was actually the date that they had her funeral instead, which is unfortunate.
And so did we ever hear anything from DiMaggio himself about that, or?
No, he was always, notoriously tight-lipped about anything that would reveal the relationship between him and Monroe. He did this out of respect to her. He didn't want, anything about his relationship with her to be exploited, and that's why he never said a word about anything.
Wow. And so let's start back with the drug use. Now, a lot of people and press have put out that she was using a lot of drugs, a lot of alcohol and sleeping pills and that. What did you find out about her drug use?
Well, she was not like any worse than any other person who was given pills at the studio. She did get addicted to sleeping pills towards the end, and her psychiatrist, Dr. Greenson, claimed he was concerned, and he, allegedly was trying to wean her off of sleeping pills with her physician, Dr. Engelberg, and he claimed that instead of her taking Nebutol, which is the one that she often takes, that she would often take, he was trying to wean her off of that and then to take chloral hydrate. And Dr. Engelberg claimed he never prescribed it, but if you look at the prescription that he wrote on June 7th, 1962, one day before she's fired from Something's Got to Give, it's very clear that Engelberg prescribed chloral hydrate, so he clearly lied when he said that Marilyn must have gotten it from Tijuana. And so they were allegedly weaning her off of these pills, but Marilyn herself said that chloral hydrate was very mild, and it was something that she really didn't particularly care for. She liked Nebutol. But as far as dependency, if she was not an alcoholic, she may have had her Dom Perignon champagne, which she loved a lot, but she was not drinking every day.
Right. And so both the Nebutol and the chlorohydrate, they're both sleeping pills or sleeping aids?
Yes, they are sleeping aids, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And so why was her doctor kind of covering himself? Was he worried that he would be in trouble then, or?
Well, I think the reason that Engelberg lied was because he realized, he says, wow, this is an awful lot of, prescriptions to be prescribing at the same time, and people might not understand if it in fact was true that they were trying to wean her off of these pills, that there were just like 15 different types of pill bottles at her bedstand at the time that she died. They were like, wow, that's an awful lot of pills, and he probably didn't want to say, yeah, I prescribed an awful lot of those. So he was definitely covering for himself, I believe.
Yeah. Sort of the same thing going on today with stars, isn't it? Different drugs, but, with Michael Jackson and Whitney Houston and all that.
Absolutely, yeah. There's always someone that these stars will find who will overprescribe for them, and that's all well and good for for what they want to do. But of course, if something goes wrong, then that's when what hits the fan.
Yeah, it's too bad, but I guess it's also tough to say no when they're a big star.
Well, that's the point. Yeah, I remember reading about Elvis Presley, and there were several occasions where the people around him tried to dry him out and put him in the hospital and have him go cold turkey and off the prescription meds and the junk food. And there was one occasion where he found some kid going past his room and said, "Hey, can you go out and get me some burgers?" And the kid did.
Well, yeah, you probably wouldn't say no. I mean, Elvis Presley at the time,
right? Exactly.
So,
yeah.
And what can you tell us about now? So that's a lot of talk, drug use, and also about the Kennedys and her relationships with both John F. and Bobby. What can you tell us about JFK and Marilyn?
Well, I can tell you that I can tell you that the JFK Marilyn affair very likely started up in the 1950s, long before he was president, actually. He suffered with severe back problems, and there was one occasion in the mid-50s where he was in the hospital, and one of the people who visited him reported that there was a portrait of Marilyn on his bedside table in the hospital room at that. So it's very likely it started that early.
Right. Yeah. And so you don't think they were having an affair at the time of her death?
Well, see, the thing is that at the time of her death, she had switched over to Bobby Kennedy, in which Fred Otash, the private eye who bugged her house and Peter Lawford's house, he noticed from all the tapes that he was listening to that there apparently now were more bugging tapes of Bobby and Marilyn as opposed to Jack and Marilyn. And so she had switched over from, sleeping with John F. Kennedy, which is a well-documented case in March 24th to March 26, 1962 at Bing Crosby's house in Palm Springs. It's very well accepted by almost every Marilyn biographer that there was a tryst there, because Ralph Roberts, her trusted masseur, came back and told Marilyn biographers, and nobody ever, doubted at all, that she did sleep with the president on that date, March 24th to March 26, 1962. And so another trusted friend, Sidney Guliroff, who was her hairstylist since the Asphalt Jungle in 1950, he also relayed in his own book that on the last day of her life, Marilyn called him about 2:30 p.m. and said that Bobby Kennedy and Peter Lawford had just left her house, and she told him in confidence that, yes, I'm sleeping with JFK, and then I'm also sleeping with Robert Kennedy, and everything had gone wrong. And so she was worried, and she said that she didn't tell a lot of people that she was having affairs with the Kennedy brothers, but she also told Guliroff that she threatened Bobby and said that I'm going to go public. And then Bobby's response, according to Marilyn, was, if you threaten me, Marilyn, there's more than one way to keep you quiet. And so at that point, Bobby left, and Marilyn was hysterical and crying when she was on the phone with Guliroff relaying all this information.
Wow. And so you also sort of partake. Now, so you think she was pregnant at the time of her death?
No, that is not true.
So she was still having an affair, you think, with both Kennedys by the time August was happening, or?
John Danoff, who was working for Bernie Spindell, he made a comment that on the tapes that he was hearing, and don't mistake this for them all having sex at the same time. That's not what it was. Marilyn was actually alternating between John F. Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy. So oftentimes it was believed that once she was done with Jack, she'd move on to Bobby. But according to John Danoff and what he heard, sometimes there were instances where she'd go with John and then go back to Bobby and then back to John again.
Right. And so now you're really kind of eliminating the suicide thought. Like you're not you're prescribing.
There's absolutely no way that she committed suicide. there's a number of compelling reasons for this. Right now, she couldn't have had enough drugs to match the amount of drugs that were in her.
We at Wondery, creators of Dr. Death, Scamfluencers, and Over My Dead Body, go deeper into complex true crime stories to give you an inside look at the facts. And now we're launching the ultimate true crime fan destination, Exhibit C. It's truly criminal. Wondery's Exhibit C gives you the detective's lens of all of the evidence, taking you step by step through the twists and turns of each true crime case. Join the Exhibit C online community to access exclusive show merchandise, member-only content, and to hear directly from top criminal and social justice experts, witnesses, and investigators as they take us beyond the evidence and into the case file. Join now by following Wondery Exhibit C on Facebook or find us on the web at WonderyExhibitC.com and listen to true crime podcasts on Wondery and Amazon Music. Exhibit C. It's truly criminal.
Blood, so she didn't have that many pills to match those amount of drugs in her body. See, she would have needed 47 Nebutols, but she had a prescription for 25 Nebutols on July 25th, 1962, and then she got a refill for 25 pills on August 3rd, 1962, so that's a total of 50. And Ralph Roberts from Missouri said she took about 6 Nebutols a day. And so that would assume that she'd wait and not take those 6 every day in order to take the 47 that killed her. But that's really just not logical. And also the fact that she had no pills in her stomach, she had absolutely nothing in her stomach, and she was purported to have 64 pills. So where did 64 pills go from her stomach?
Yeah, and another thing is that, there are photos actually of the death scene shot by the police, and you see empty pill bottles on the bedside table with the caps all neatly screwed back on. I mean, someone in that state, if they're kind of, shoving pills down their throat at that rate, would they then take the time to meticulously put the caps back on these empty bottles and just line them up on the table? It was a staged scene.
Now, what did the coroner give for an opinion then?
The coroner did a really strange thing. Coroner Curfey, he gave this press conference. She was murdered on August 4th, 1962. The body was discovered dead on the 5th. And then on the 18th, he gave this public press conference in which he said, quote, it is our opinion that it is a probable suicide. He said that it is our opinion. So he's not even saying that this is definitive. He's just, causing more and more speculation, which is really suspicious because he did assert that she would have had to have swallowed 47 Nebutols and a large amount of chlorohydrate. And yet Dr. Noguchi has always, stated it was suicide. But over the years, when you see him on camera, like on History's Mysteries, he'll say stuff like, the coroner's office tried to prove suicide, but they couldn't, actually show any factors that would lead to suicide. So he's kind of playing around it, but without diverting from his initial findings. But you could tell that there's more that he knows than he's saying.
Right. And so now you were mentioning that she was being bugged. Like there was people basically listening to her.
Yes, I spoke with the sound man who went with Fred Otash the night that she died, and he, was responsible for listening to those tapes. And he said that yes, Bobby and Marilyn were sleeping together, and yes, John F. Kennedy and Marilyn Monroe were sleeping together from what he heard on the tapes. And I mean, he was the one that was listening to them. He's the one that took him out on the orders of the Kennedys. Fred Otash had many different clients. He was working, for Jimmy Hoffa at one point in which the bugs were installed. He noticed that other bugs were also installed when he was putting them in there. So there were many different people listening in. There was the FBI, the CIA, Jimmy Hoffa, at one point even Howard Hughes, according to Fred Otash. And so many different clients were there listening in on what Marilyn was doing.
I mean, J. Edgar Hoover was no fan of the Kennedys, so any evidence he could get on their indiscretions, was gold dust to him. So, as Jay says, there were many vested interests in this.
So what can you tell us about her last day then?
Well, she threatened to hold a press conference, and, when Bobby Kennedy came to her house and said, hey, you can't see me, you can't see Jack, we don't want you to write anymore, we don't want you to call anymore. And so I've always found it suspicious that once I've discovered that Bobby Kennedy was at her house, that all of a sudden she just has a lethal amount of drugs in her body a few hours later. I mean, is that just like a really strange coincidence? I don't think so. The two events are connected. This is totally scary. How a man like Bobby Kennedy can try to attempt to hide his presence at her house and then say, oh, I was at John Bates, ranch in Gilroy, near San Francisco. How could he, do that unless he had these absolutely powerful resources to cover up every one of his tracks? And that's exactly what he did. But there's like more than 20 witnesses that saw him there, so he can't deny that.
And so you're kind of putting him behind the murder then?
Yes, he was the one that made it happen.
Okay. And so who do you think who else was involved? You're putting like the psychiatrist?
Ralph Greenson, Ralph Greenson, the psychiatrist, stuck a heart needle into her chest. He tried to play it off for any witnesses, including the ambulance attendants who were witnessing that it was like adrenaline, but it wasn't, because James Hall, the ambulance attendant, said, well, I've always stated it was a brownish fluid. So it was an undiluted pentobarbital injection to the heart. But according to James Hall, the attendant, he said that Greenson told him, I've got to make a show of this. So Greenson's trying to make it sound like he's trying to help her, but he's really trying to kill her. And so he sticks it into her heart. And there were 5 eyewitnesses. There's the 2 attendants, James Hall, Murray Leibowitz. Murray Leibowitz told Donald Wolfe in 1993 that, yes, James Hall's telling the truth. And then Peter Lawford confirms the 2 attendants by stating, quote, Marilyn has got to be silenced, Bobby told Greenson, or something to that effect. Greenson had thus been set up by Bobby to take care of Marilyn, end quote. And so the reason that Greenson has the motive to do this is, A, he's sick and tired of his patient. He constantly complains that he has to deal with her 6-7 times a week when she's calling up. And the thing that put him over the top was that Greenson was tricked by Bobby Kennedy. Bobby said to him, look, not only is she going to go public on Monday morning, August 6th, with his press conference exposing me and Jack, she's going to go and expose you too with your affair with her. And so Bobby used Greenson to get rid of Marilyn. See, Bobby convinced the psychiatrist that Marilyn would also go public with the psychiatrist, but in reality, Marilyn was only going to go public with Bobby and Jack. But Bobby convinced him that he would go public with Greenson's affair too. Marilyn was sleeping with Greenson. She was not going to go public with that affair. Bobby just convinced him that that was true.
And that was, for Greenson as a psychiatrist, not only was he married, but, that went against professional ethics, so that would get him disbarred.
Right. And so after the murder, what was Greenson's kind of view on it? Did he ever talk about it, or did anybody ever follow up with him?
Yes, Greenson did a very strange thing. Roy Turner, who was Marilyn's genealogist, he once wrote to Greenson in 8th grade because he was doing like this, book report, and he chose Marilyn. And so he had to write to Greenson and say, well, what is this whole business about how she died? And so Greenson wrote him back and said, well, I just want to make it very clear that she did not commit suicide. And so that goes against, the official verdict. And so it's very strange how he keeps hinting that, she didn't commit suicide, because he did love his patient, but he did feel, very bitter after he realized that Bobby Kennedy had tricked him, because he perhaps may not have gone through with it, even though he was sick of his patient. I think that just tricking him into thinking that his affair would be exposed, that's the thing that really got him to do it. Otherwise, I'm pretty convinced he may not have gone through with that.
So Now, on her last day, did anybody talk to her before she died, or did she get anybody have any witness of what her mood was like? If she was depressed, if she was happy?
Oh yes, Gloria Romanoff told me that on August 5th, the evening of August 5th, August 5th was the day that she was discovered dead. But the evening, she said that Marilyn had a dinner engagement with Frank Sinatra, and also Gloria Romanoff would be there. And she told me that she was so happy about wanting to, go and see him. And she was thinking about, well, what should I wear? What kind of dress should I wear? She was just really, focused on attending that dinner engagement. So why would she kill herself? And Ralph Roberts said that last weekend she was the happiest that he had ever seen her in quite some time. And so he actually made a statement himself and said, I think somebody done her in. He said that, and he doesn't believe that she committed suicide. He called Greenson at 6 p.m. on the last day of Marilyn's life, trying to confirm a dinner engagement that he and Marilyn had on August 4th, the evening of August 4th. And he answered the phone. Greenson said, she's not here right now, and he hung up, and he was all rude about it. And so, Ralph Roberts thought that was very suspicious. He did not trust, the official verdict, and at that point, he is one of the many trusted friends, including George Barris, who believe that she was murdered.
Yeah, I mean, a number of people I spoke with, have to bear in mind that, of course, people can express, they're feeling great or whatever, to friends, loved ones, and then still kill themselves. They may be hiding something, or their mind may just flip on them. But there were an overwhelming number of people who even told me during the course of, researching the original book, my Blonde Heat book, that she seemed very upbeat in that last week of her life. The story has always been that, she was so depressed about the end of the relationship with the Kennedys. But in fact, her stand-in, Evelyn Moriarty, who was Marilyn's stand-in on her final 3 movies, said that she spoke with Marilyn a couple of nights before she died, and she was really upbeat because she'd won the battle with 20th Century Fox, and she couldn't wait to get back to work, and she was phoning the members of the cast and crew, really excited and looking forward to, what was coming up for her. So, again, that is not, definitive evidence that she didn't commit suicide, but it's another contributing piece of evidence.
Right. So did she attempt suicide before in her life, or was this like
Yes, she did. There were about maybe half a dozen times when she attempted suicide before. Natasha Lytesk can attest to a time when she had just been dropped from Columbia Pictures. And, she just knew that Marilyn wanted to be the best actress that she could be. And when she was dropped, that was just very discouraging to her. So she felt, there was an attempt to take her life there. But Arthur Miller can also attest to a time. And it wasn't like, it was just a part of her life where she felt discouraged. She had more strength later on. She was able to be more confident in being an actress, and she knew that was what she was going to do, is be the best actress that she could be. She wanted to get away from all these dumb blonde roles. She wanted to just do serious roles that were not going to just pigeonhole her and make it so that she'd be doing the same movie over and over again.
Yeah. Now that's a tough thing in itself. Anytime someone even stars today, if they get kind of, certain frame, people think of them as a certain thing. It's a tough thing to change.
Well, it is. She was. I mean, as I said before, that was, something that she was battling right through her career, was to divest herself of the dumb blonde image and someone who was kind of helpless. And the fact that she had attempted suicide and did have a sleeping pill problem and did enjoy the Dom Perignon, that, of course, really helped with, the stories that she basically killed herself, that she was irresponsible, was a wreck of a human being and wanted to die.
So do you think this was really, premeditated? Like, did they sort of plan the date and the time and what they were going to do, or was it just sort of, did the events just occur?
I think that, it just, everything led to another part of it happening. It was not something that was like completely planned. There was one thing that was for sure. Bobby Kennedy could not find that red diary of Marilyn's, the night that she died, so they had to go to plan B, and so Bobby, contacted the psychiatrist. According to Peter Lawford, Bobby called up Greenson and told him, said, hey, look, she's going public with your affair too. You got to do this thing. And so he gave him a needle, and then, Greenson stuck it into Marilyn's heart, and that was the end of that. And then, about 4 hours later after all this, Greenson's the one that calls the police and says, hey, she committed suicide. He tells us Sergeant Jack Clemens. And so it's very curious how he's telling the first officer at the scene that she committed suicide, and then he's telling other people down the line that she did not commit suicide. You see, because it makes him look bad that a patient allegedly committed suicide. It makes him look like he's an unsuccessful psychiatrist. So it makes his whole image, it tarnishes his image. So he's has this balancing act. He's got to balance Bobby Kennedy, and then he's got to balance, his whole reputation of the fact that his patient purported to commit suicide. So there's a lot of things going on in his mind.
Right. And so what did the ambulance drivers think? The people that showed up, didn't they notice her, and him jabbing her in the heart? And
Yes. You see, here's the thing, is that James Hall said that there was nothing sinister at the time that he witnessed this. He thought it was adrenaline, and that he tried to save her, and it failed. And that, she was overdosing. But he said that there was something very strange. When he started to smell her mouth, there was no odor of pear, so there's no way she could have swallowed those chloral hydrate pills. And so he also noticed there's no indication of vomit. Most people who take a lot of drugs, they vomit the pills up. He said there was no indication of vomit. He said that she was still alive and that she was still breathing, but just barely. And so he tried to get her off of the bed. They put her on the floor so that they can give her CPR. Her color started to come back. And then all of a sudden, Greenson pushes him aside and says, give her positive pressure. And so then Greenson pulls out of his little bag, his medical bag, and pulls out a heart needle with a syringe with a heart needle already affixed to it. And then he says, I got to insert this between the blank and blank ribs. And then he just inserts it right into her heart. And then he says, I'm going to pronounce her dead after a few minutes. And so James Hall thought this was so strange. He thought that had he not come in there, they could have safely taken her away to the hospital.
Right.
But it wasn't until 20 years later, when they did a serious investigation of this case, when he learned for the first time that the autopsy report said there were no pills in her stomach, he said, well, now I kind of question what I saw. And he always mentioned it was a brownish fluid. And so that's not adrenaline. Right.
And so there was nothing in her stomach. Wouldn't that sort of bring up questions?
Yes, absolutely, because, there are enough drugs in her blood to kill 3 people. You see, there were 4.5 milligrams % of Nebutol in her blood, which is equivalent to 47 Nebutols. And then there's 8 milligrams % of chloral hydrate in her blood, which is equivalent to 17 chloral hydrates. That's about 64 pills. And yet, Noguchi says, I didn't find any refractal crystals from any of the Nebutol, no refractal crystals from any of the chloral hydrate. And all the medical professionals that are competent that you interview, they will tell you that there should have been undissolved capsules. So what that means is that she didn't swallow the drugs that killed her.
And do you think this could have happened today? Now, if this was
No. There's no way this could have happened today. Something on YouTube would have been on there in a few minutes. I mean, somebody would have, captured something with their iPhone. The neighbors, actually, Mary W. Goody Coons Barnes, who was her neighbor at 12304, where Mrs. Murray, the housekeeper, and her son-in-law, Norman Jeffries, where they stayed while they waited for Bobby Kennedy and these 2 police officers, Archie Case and James Ahern, to leave. She saw Bobby Kennedy go in there, Mary W. Goody Coons Barnes. She saw Bobby Kennedy go in there with Archie Case and James Ahern. And so had she had an iPhone, she would have been capturing them on camera. But of course this was back in 1962, and so we didn't have any of that. And the principals at the scene were able to control the scene, pretty much by just having all their people cover it up.
Yeah, and that's very true. A lot of our listeners, we do a lot of stuff from JFK's assassination and stuff, and people don't realize how different it was. Now, were you able to talk to the neighbors, or did they ever make a statement?
Well, see, Mary W. Goody Coons Barnes, she died in 1964, and she talked to Sergeant Jack Clemens in 1962, days after Marilyn's death. And she didn't give her name to Sergeant Jack Clemens, but the reason that we found out for the very first time in all the books written on Marilyn Monroe was, and it's not even on the deeds of the house on 12304 Fifth Helena Drive. See, Joan Greenson wrote in her manuscript, which is sealed from the public until 2039, that, quote, Marilyn found out that the neighbor you could see from her property was a professor at the university. This was UCLA professor Ralph Mosser Barnes, and his wife was Mary W. Goody Coons Barnes. And so we now know who that neighbor was that spoke to Sergeant Jack Clemens, but she passed away in 1964. And Clemens relayed that she saw Bobby Kennedy and those two men go into her house at nighttime on the last, night of her life. And so we also have statements by the neighbors Abe Landau and Ruby Landau who assert that there was an ambulance, around midnight, and that's when they got home, from their dinner party, and the Landaus reported that there was an ambulance there. This is the same observation that Fred Otash made to Lynn Franklin, to Detective Lynn Franklin. He also notated that an ambulance was present at the scene.
Wow. Amazing story. So, how do people get a hold of you guys? Do you have a web page or anything people should know about?
Well, in my case, it's richardbuskin.com, RICHARDBUSKIN.com, and that will basically give the lowdown on my career, the books I've written. I've written over 30 books, so you can see samples of my work on there, and the book obviously is up on Amazon.
Right.
Okay, you can get a hold of me at Marilyn Monroe 1962 at Outlook.com if you have any questions.
Well, guys, thank you very much.
To find out more about our show, guests, or to listen to past shows from our archive, please go to www.houseofmysteryradio.com.
The mission has been completed.
The end. By George, he's got it. It is the end. I'll say it.
If you're lying to me, I'll be back.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
Acast powers the world's best podcasts. Here's a show that we recommend.
Hi, I'm Christopher Kimball, host of Milk Street Radio. If you'd like to change the way you cook and also think about food, please check out the Milk Street podcast. We travel around the world to find pizza in Tokyo, Egyptian food in Berlin, and Bhutanese farmers in Vermont. We speak to Jamie Oliver, Rachel Ray, Al Roker, Ina Garten, as well as Michael Twitty, Marcus Samuelson, and Alice Waters. And we'll introduce you to recipes that will change the way you cook, from bright pink Tottenham cake to Afghan dumplings to shoyu sugar steak, and that one is direct from Hawaii. It's a whole new world of food right here on Milk Street Radio. Please check us out on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts, or go to 177milkstreet.com.
Acast helps creators launch, grow, and monetize their podcasts everywhere. Acast.com.
You've been listening to the House of Mystery radio show. To find out more about our guests, hosts, or show, go to www.houseofmystery.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Well, good night.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.